Today I'd like to take a look at a wine from Domaine Rewa in Central Otago in the Pisa sub-region. This is a small, family-owned, organically farmed winery that's run by a Kiwi and her French potter husband. So the wine in question is Domaine Rewa's 2022 Chardonnay. And the property that is now Domaine Rewa was originally planted back in 1997 and 1998 by Tony and Joan Lawrence. And they call the property Aromas, and you can still see Aromas wines in the market. And their first vintage was 2001. Now, this vineyard is on the 45th parallel, and that is actually commemorated on the label there. Subsequently, the Lawrences developed another vineyard near Cromwell, the Wairere vineyard. That became their home block, and the Lawrences were forced to sell their 45th parallel vineyard in 2009. When Phillippa Fourbet, the estate's current owner, saw that the property was for sale, she grasped the opportunity to return home to New Zealand, bring her family back, and to be involved in an agricultural business which tied in very conveniently with her love for food and wine. She was obviously enthusiastic because 4 days later she and her husband Yannick were the owners of this small Central Otago vineyard. So Philippa, a New Zealander, had met Yannick when she was working in London. She was working in finance there. He didn't live in London. He was the proprietor of a pottery, Les Chênes Verts, in Anduze in southern France. Evidently, Philippa was initially interested in the artisanal pots rather than the potter. They very quickly fell in love, settled down, started a family, then chose to move to the other side of the world, to New Zealand. And these days, Yannick is able to craft his pots in a studio in the vineyards. In fact, they make a skin contact Pinot Gris, which is partially aged in 350 litre amphora, which Yannick actually makes on the property. Domaine Rewa is a 5.5 hectare estate, and there they have planted Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir, with the majority of the plantings being Pinot Noir. The vines are planted around the house on gentle slopes which rise from the Ludgate Road up to the Pisa foothills, and it's at the top where there's a terrace that they have Riesling growing. The soils here are free-draining, friable soils. They're glacial and fluvial rock deposits, and they comprise sort of gravels, sand and clay. And these are well suited to grape growing as they're low in fertility and high in mineral content. The name Domaine Rewa actually is in honour of Philippa's maternal grandmother. But the Rewa, which I assume is what the leaves you see on the label are, is sort of the New Zealand equivalent of the honeysuckle. It's a tree whose pollen the bees absolutely love. And that sits quite nicely alongside the environmentally aware philosophy that surrounds this domain. So all the wines here are organic. The estate was certified as organic in 2013 by BioGrow. These are all single vineyard wines, and their approach, as well as being organic, is sustainable, and they do use some biodynamic practices as well. And in fact, from the beginning, back in 1997, Aromas Wines was committed to this environmentally aware philosophy. And Philippa and Yannick's approach to managing the property continues to be holistic and sustainable. They have bees there, they've planted olive trees. In fact, they've planted somewhere over 500 trees. They're looking to encourage biodiversity. One of their major approaches is composting. So any natural waste that's coming from production, be it the mar at the end of pressing or cuttings from the vineyard, is mixed with local straw, turned into a compost and returned to the vineyards. The 2022 vintage was quite a large, fruitful vintage. Evidently there was a warm spring and summer that allowed the vines to set quite a large crop. Unfortunately, a cool, wet February gave many challenges to the vignerons, just in terms of timing of harvest. I think that was harder for the red wines than for the white, but at a time when they were still under COVID-19 regulations, when there was a limited supply of labour, they had to time picking very carefully to avoid rain and the subsequent rot and dilution problems that might have resulted. So the Chardonnay clones planted here are fairly typical of the sort of clones that would have been planted in the late 90s. So you've got Mendoza clone, which was probably the first high quality clone of Chardonnay found in New Zealand, and then you've got clone 15. Both of those can give quite a lean style of Chardonnay and are quite good at maintaining their acidity. The fruit was hand harvested on the 22nd of March and everything was whole bunch pressed. The juice went straight into 225 litre French oak barriques. of which 36% were new. The wine fermented entirely en barrique, and fermentation was allowed to start using the indigenous yeasts that were in the vineyard and had made their way into the winery on the fruit. All the wine underwent malolactic conversion to give it a little bit extra roundness and to take some of the sharpness out of the acidity. And then the wine stayed in barrel, aging for 9 months. It aged with its lees, and those lees were stirred weekly. So the lees of dead yeast breaking down, helping to feed and give a little bit of fatness and roundness to the wine. Also helping to protect the wine from oxidation during that period as well, because the lees will oxidize more readily than the wine. Then bottling came on the 13th of March in the year following, in 2023. It suggested this is a wine that can be aged for 3 to 4 years before drinking, but should be fine now. So let's take a look at it, shall we? First thing to say, we have a really pale yellow colour there. The alcohol is noted on the bottle as being 14.5%. I think the analysis is actually 14.42, but let's not split hairs. The wine has certain viscosity. It's forming some quite obvious tears there as it rolls down the sides of the glass. So let's see what we're making of the aromas, shall we? Actually, I have to say, I've been sitting here and the aromas have been quite obvious. And yes, there's a lovely, rich, tropical, peachy note there. There's a richness, there's toasty touches from the oak, and there's an obvious leesiness, sort of a yeasty component, helping to marry sort of slight cedary and vanilla notes with that lovely, rich sort of tropical fruit. It's really quite attractive, quite a powerful aroma. So let's have a taste, shall we? I was talking about powerful, rich, tropical fruit. Certainly there's that lovely peachiness to the fore. There's almost a richness of something like mango or something like that. I suppose there are some very slight greenish hints towards the front, giving some sort of freshness. The acidity's good. There's a clean mineral crispness. I'm talking about green elements. There isn't really a sort of a tart green apple note, probably because the malolactic conversion would have got rid of those notes, but there is still some sort of fresh sort of green gauge note there, and the good acidity coming through also, it gives a sort of a pineapple note on the mid palate, but the fruit is reverting to a much more ripe, peachy style at the end of the finish. There's some fresh citric acidity, almost a note of grapefruit there towards the end of the long finish. There I can also see some little notes of cedariness, perhaps some vanilla, and a little bit of yeasty roundness. Given the fact that there were some quite challenging decisions to make around harvest in 2022, I think they've made an excellent job with this. This really is a wine that has power, richness, it's quite to the fore. It may not be a wine for aging for 7 or 8 or 9 years, but it already has a lovely harmony. The fruit and the oak notes are well married, and those can only get more harmonious if we were to give the wine a couple more years. There's a lovely freshness, and those slight green elements I'm noting help to enliven the wine's attack. I don't see that as a derogatory or unripe sort of note. The wine has reasonable weight. I would say it was medium to full-bodied. It's got nice length and freshness. There's an elegant aspect to it as well as its power. Looking at the Wine Central Otago critics score, this wine scored 93 out of 100. I think that's a very well-deserved score. I think that's pretty much spot on. I should say it's a wine that was only produced in very small numbers. I think there were 4,526 bottles of this made. So if you like the idea of trying Domaine Rewa's Chardonnay, I wouldn't wait for too long. I think at the winery they may already have moved on to the next vintage. So yes, a lovely wine, drinking nicely now. Certainly good for keeping for 2 or 3 years. One which I think will provide some really enjoyable drinking over that time. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope that you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. That would be superb. If you're watching these tastings and enjoying them, do please consider subscribing to my channel, because that would really help us. The more subscribers we have, the more that YouTube's algorithms are likely to promote the channel. If you have any comments you'd like to leave, do please pop them in the box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. And if you have friends you think might like to watch the videos, it would be great if you'd pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. Now, I do have another tasting of a wine from Domaine Rewa. I will leave a link to that. That's their Pinot Noir from 2020. And I'll also leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see if it's in your market, who the distributors are, and what the price is. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope that maybe you'll make some time and come and join me for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.